It's a cold, quiet evening in a small town that most people have never heard of. But tonight, this place will become the setting for a historic moment. As the clock strikes 9:13 p.m., an execution is about to take place. It is a moment that will forever be etched in the memories of those who bear witness, some seeking justice, others simply wondering how it all came to this. Tonight, a woman named Lois Nadean Smith will die by lethal injection. At 61 years old, Lois doesn't look like a killer. In fact, she looks like someone's grandmother. She has gray hair, weathered hands, and a face that could easily belong to the woman you see at church or in the grocery store. Her appearance is unassuming, even comforting, yet she is about to become one of the most infamous figures in Oklahoma's history. In 2001, Oklahoma is on track to break records. 17 people have already been executed in the state, more than any other state in the nation. In fact, it's more than Texas, which is typically known for leading the country in executions. Lois is about to be number 17. She is not just another number in a growing tally. Her case is different. Hers is a story of brutality, family loyalty, and the complex line between protection and vengeance. But this story doesn't begin with a woman strapped to a gurney, ready to meet her end. It begins years before, with a nickname that would haunt Lois for decades. Back in high school, everyone knew her as Mean Nadean. Even as a teenager, she was feared for her temper. She was known to lash out without warning, her anger quick to surface and just as quickly forgotten by those who witnessed it. That temper would define Lois's life, but it would also set the stage for something much darker. Fast forward to July 4th, 1982, a holiday that most people associate with fireworks and celebrations. But for Lois, it would be a day that would forever change the lives of a family in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. On that fateful morning, Lois didn't just kill someone, she tortured them. She laughed while she did it. And the victim? A 21-year-old woman named Cindy Bailey. Cindy's only crime was dating the wrong man. She had once been in a relationship with Lois's son, Greg. But that relationship had ended badly. Rumors were circulating around town, rumors that Cindy had threatened Greg's life, rumors that she had planned to tell the police about his involvement in illegal activities. It didn't matter whether the rumors were true or not. For Lois, this was all the justification she needed. In her mind, Cindy had become a threat to her son, and no one threatened her family. What followed was not a moment of anger, but a cold, calculated decision that would end in one of the most brutal murders in the state's history. Lois shot Cindy 9 times. She stabbed her in the throat. But the worst part wasn't the gunshots or the stab wound. No, the worst part was what Lois did after she killed Cindy, what she did while Cindy was still alive. Lois didn't just want to kill Cindy, she wanted to make her suffer. She wanted to watch her die. And when Lois's son Greg reloaded the gun, Lois didn't pause. Instead, she jumped on Cindy's neck, crushing it with her feet, while laughing, as if this horrific act were some twisted game. This was a mother, a grandmother, a woman who was supposed to protect her family. And yet on that morning in 1982, she became a monster. But what turned Lois from a mother who loved and protected her children into a woman capable of such unspeakable violence? This is the question we'll try to answer. What led Lois to commit one of Oklahoma's most heinous murders? What twisted path did she walk down from the protective mother to the cold-blooded killer? And perhaps most chilling of all, how did her own son become her accomplice? This is the story of Lois Nadean Smith, who, despite her unassuming appearance, would become the symbol of a darker side of human nature, of loyalty gone wrong, and of how one woman's distorted sense of protection led to a crime so horrific. It would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. As we delve into her story, remember this isn't just a tale of a woman who committed a brutal crime. It's a reflection of how sometimes the line between justice and vengeance becomes painfully blurred. And in this case, the execution of Lois Nadean Smith would be the final price she would pay for the nightmare she unleashed on Cindy Bailey and her family. This is where the story begins. July 4th, 1982, Tahlequah, Oklahoma, it's Independence Day morning. In most homes across America, families are preparing for barbecues, fireworks, and a day filled with patriotism. But in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, one family has plans that will forever shatter the lives of everyone involved. On this day, there is no celebration, no joy, only darkness. Lois Smith's morning doesn't begin with fireworks or the smell of grilled burgers. It begins with a decision that will take her son, Greg, her accomplice, and another woman to a small motel where a 21-year-old woman named Cindy Bailey is staying. Cindy had once been in a relationship with Greg, but things had taken a bitter turn. The young couple had broken up, but the aftermath of their split would lead to something far worse than either of them could have imagined. Cindy Bailey, despite being only 21, was already dealing with rumors that would haunt her for years. People in town were saying that she had threatened Greg's life. Others claimed she was going to expose Greg's involvement in illegal activities, rumors that could destroy his future. Some whispered that Cindy wanted him dead. To Lois, these rumors were not just gossip. They were a death sentence for Cindy. For Lois, there was no room for uncertainty. No amount of doubt would cloud her mind. Lois believed that Cindy was a threat to her son, and in her twisted sense of protection, there was only one way to deal with a threat. Cindy had to die. This wasn't just a snap decision born from a moment of rage. It was a cold, calculated act of vengeance. So on that morning, Lois climbed into the car with Greg and the other woman. They drove to the motel where Cindy was staying. Cindy had no reason to suspect anything out of the ordinary. After all, she and Greg had been together for some time before their breakup. But what Cindy didn't know was that when she got into that car, her life was already over. As soon as the door slammed shut, the tension in the vehicle was palpable. Cindy sat in the back seat, feeling the weight of Lois's icy stare. She may have thought that Lois had invited her for a conversation to clear up whatever had gone wrong between Greg and her, but she was wrong. The moment she closed that car door, she sealed her fate. Lois turned around, locking eyes with Cindy. In a voice that was calm but laced with cold fury, she spoke. "I heard what you've been saying about my son." Cindy's face drained of color. She must have known exactly what Lois was referring to, the rumors that had spread like wildfire around town. "I heard you threatened to have Greg killed," Lois continued. Her voice unnervingly calm. Cindy's reaction was immediate. She shook her head frantically. "No, that's not true. I never said that. I would never." "You're lying." But Lois was not interested in Cindy's protests. She wasn't there to listen to reason. Lois had made up her mind. In that moment, Cindy wasn't just a young woman with her own life, her own struggles. To Lois, Cindy was a threat to her son's safety, to her family. And Lois would do whatever it took to eliminate that threat. What happened next would be the beginning of a nightmare. Lois reached into the front seat, pulled out a knife, and with a quick, brutal motion, plunged it deep into Cindy's throat. The blade sliced through the skin with ease, and Cindy's body jerked in shock. She gasped, her hands flying up to her throat, but it was already too late. Blood poured from the wound, splattering across the seats, turning the car into a macabre scene. Cindy was still alive, still conscious, but every breath was a struggle. The world around her became a blur of fear, pain, and confusion, and in that moment, Lois did something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She didn't stop. She didn't hesitate. With the same cold demeanor, she pressed harder, twisting the knife to ensure maximum damage. The other woman in the car watched in horror, but said nothing. Greg, her son, sat silently, his face a mixture of confusion and fear. He said nothing, as though he was a passive observer in this twisted scene. But as the violence escalated, Greg's role in the unfolding tragedy would soon become undeniable. Lois was far from finished. After delivering the fatal stab wound, she looked at Greg and ordered him to drive to Gans, to my ex-husband's house. The car sped down the Oklahoma countryside. Cindy, gasping for air, fought to stay conscious. The blood continued to flow from her wound, staining the seat beneath her. She was barely able to hold herself upright, but in her eyes was the primal will to survive. Yet in the car with her there was no mercy, no compassion, only a mother who had made up her mind to see Cindy dead, and a son who was about to become an accomplice in a crime he would never be able to escape. As they neared their destination, Cindy's strength waned. The blood loss, combined with the shock and terror, had already begun to drain her. But she was still alive. She was still conscious, and when they pulled into the driveway of Lois's ex-husband's house in Gans, she had no idea what awaited her inside. What she didn't know was that the worst was yet to come. Cindy was dragged from the car, barely able to stand, her life slipping away with every painful step. She was forced into the house, her body trembling, her heart racing with the instinct to survive. She probably thought that this was where her suffering would end. At least, in her mind, the safety of the house might offer a small glimpse of relief. But Lois had other plans. Lois had already decided how Cindy would die, and there would be no mercy. Inside the house in Gans, Lois and Greg's sadistic plan would come to fruition. This wasn't going to be a quick death. Lois had something far worse in mind for Cindy. The house, once a place of family and memories, became the site of an unthinkable nightmare. Lois forced Cindy into a recliner. The chair, which should have been a place of rest, became her torture seat. With the blood still pouring from her throat, Cindy was weak, too weak to fight back. She had no strength left to escape. The knife wound in her throat had done its damage, and Cindy was now at the mercy of Lois, who was determined to make her suffer. Lois pulled out a pistol. The same cold, calm demeanor she had carried with her since the moment the knife entered Cindy's throat remained. She pointed the gun directly at Cindy's face. "You're going to die today," Lois said, her words cold and detached. "I'm going to kill you for what you said about my son." Cindy's voice trembled as she begged for her life. "Please, I never threatened, Greg, I swear. Please don't do this." But Lois wasn't listening. She wasn't there to listen to Cindy's pleas. She was there to punish, to silence the threat in her mind once and for all. Lois was about to turn Cindy's final moments into a slow, agonizing death. The first gunshot hit Cindy in the chest, throwing her from the recliner and onto the floor. She was bleeding heavily, but she was still alive. Still breathing. Most people, even hardened criminals, would have stopped there. But not Lois, not today. To understand the horrific events of July 4th, 1982, we must first explore the mind of the woman responsible. Lois Nadean Smith's transformation from a loving mother to a ruthless killer is not an overnight change. It is the culmination of years of personal trauma, deep-seated anger, and a warped sense of protection for her family, especially her son, Greg. Lois Smith was born in 1940 in Oklahoma. Her early life was far from easy. She grew up in an environment where violence and hardship were constants. She married young, as many did in those days, but what was meant to be a union of love soon turned into a nightmare. Lois married an alcoholic, a man whose abuse would leave deep scars on her body and mind. For years, Lois endured physical and emotional beatings. Bruises covered her body. Broken bones marked her painful existence. Yet she stayed, likely trapped by the same sense of duty and loyalty that would later define her actions with her children. The cycle of abuse did not end with Lois. The torment she faced in her marriage was passed on to her children. The constant emotional and physical battering she endured left Lois emotionally battered and hardened. But when she finally left her abusive husband, she was determined to make a life for herself and her children without the weight of an oppressive, toxic marriage hanging over her. She became a single mother, raising her children alone in an era when this was not as common as it is today. Lois had to navigate a world that wasn't kind to single mothers, especially ones who had no formal education or a career to fall back on. But she persevered, finding work, paying bills, and maintaining the illusion of a stable, normal life for her children. On the surface, Lois was the image of a responsible, hard-working woman. To her neighbors and co-workers, she seemed like any other mother, someone you might see at the grocery store, picking up food for a family dinner, or attending church on Sundays. But those who knew Lois in high school saw a different side of her. They knew her as Mean Nadean. It wasn't just a nickname, it was a warning. Lois had a terrible temper, one that frightened even her classmates. As a young girl, Lois was known to lash out in violent bursts when she didn't get her way. The temper, the anger, It was all buried beneath the surface, simmering and waiting for the right moment to erupt. What those who knew her back then didn't know was that this anger was the product of years of trauma. Lois had never learned how to manage her emotions or channel her frustration. Her abusive marriage had eroded any semblance of emotional balance she once had, leaving behind a woman who was fiercely protective of her children, but who had a twisted sense of what protection meant. Lois's children became her world. After years of feeling helpless, beaten down, and alone, she poured all her love and energy into raising them. But it wasn't just love that Lois offered. It was control, overprotectiveness taken to extremes. The idea of her children facing harm, being threatened, or being in any kind of danger, real or imagined, was enough to set Lois off. Her protective instinct, honed over years of struggle and pain, had morphed into something much darker. The story of Cindy Bailey's murder didn't begin with a knife or a gun. It began with Lois's unwavering belief that she would do anything to protect her son, even if that meant going to extreme and ultimately criminal lengths. Greg, Lois's son, was no angel. There were rumors about him, ones that Lois took very seriously. He was allegedly involved in illegal activities, including drugs, and Cindy, his ex-girlfriend, was allegedly a threat to expose him. But whether or not these rumors were true hardly mattered to Lois. In her mind, Cindy's very existence posed a risk to Greg's safety, and no one, not even a young woman like Cindy, could be allowed to jeopardize her son's future. Lois's warped sense of protection made her believe that anyone who posed a threat to Greg had to be eliminated. Her mind worked in black and white, with no room for nuance or forgiveness. Cindy, in Lois's eyes, had crossed the line. She had become a threat to the family. And Lois believed that the only way to solve this problem was with violence. But there's something chilling about the way Lois saw herself in all of this. She wasn't acting out of personal malice or desire for revenge. At least, that's not how she saw it. Lois believed she was justified in her actions. She thought she was doing what any mother would do, protecting her child. The twisted logic behind her belief was that, for Greg to be safe, Cindy had to be silenced. Lois's love for her son had clouded her judgment, transforming her into something she had never been before, a killer. Her relationship with Greg was, in a way, symbiotic. She had raised him, protected him, and, in return, he had become her ally, her partner in crime. There was a bond between them, a sense of loyalty that, while understandable in some contexts, would lead to a nightmare scenario. Greg, the young man who should have been the voice of reason, became an unwilling participant in his mother's plans. He helped her carry out the murder, reloading the gun when Lois ran out of ammunition. Greg's passivity in the car and his willingness to comply with Lois's orders reveal a chilling truth. In Lois's eyes, his obedience to her commands was more important than his own moral compass. The fact that Greg helped his mother kill Cindy shows just how far Lois had warped his sense of right and wrong. To him, this was his mother, his protector, doing what needed to be done. And when Lois laughed as she jumped on Cindy's neck, Greg did nothing. He didn't stop her. He didn't question her. Instead, he simply complied, following his mother's orders like a soldier following a command. This is where Lois's psychological unraveling becomes clear. She wasn't just trying to protect Greg from a perceived threat. She had become consumed by her need to control his life and safeguard him from anything she saw as dangerous. What started as a desire to shield him from harm had transformed into a twisted justification for murder. The line between protection and destruction had become impossibly blurred. Lois's actions weren't those of a woman driven to madness by a single moment of anger. They were the culmination of years of conditioning, years of protecting her children at all costs, even if that meant destroying anyone she deemed a threat. And in the case of Cindy Bailey, Lois decided that the threat was too great to ignore. Lois's mindset, shaped by years of trauma, fear, and love, led her to commit an act that no amount of justification could ever undo. Now, with the violence of that day forever etched in the memories of everyone involved, Lois's dark transformation from a mother to a killer would be the driving force behind a story of punishment, remorse, and unthinkable betrayal. This was no longer just about protecting her son. It was about revenge, control, and the unchecked power of a mother's love gone horribly wrong. And as the murder unfolded, the question became not just why Lois did it, but how a mother who had been through so much pain and hardship could turn that pain into a force of destruction that would haunt her and her son for the rest of their lives. After the bloodshed in the car, the nightmare was only beginning for Cindy Bailey. The tension that had built up on that harrowing drive to Gans would soon culminate in a level of cruelty that shocked even hardened investigators. This part of the story paints a chilling portrait of Lois's cold-bloodedness, the terror Cindy endured in the house, and the heartbreaking involvement of Lois's own son in the brutal murder. The car ride from the motel to Gans was quiet, except for Cindy's weak, panicked breathing as she tried to hold on to life. Her body was weak from blood loss, her mind clouded by shock and fear. Still, she fought to stay conscious, hoping, perhaps against all reason, that there was a chance she might survive. The blood soaking through her shirt and pooling on the seat was proof that her time was running out. But Cindy wasn't ready to die. She wasn't ready to give up, not just yet. Lois, however, had already made her decision. For her, there was no mercy. Cindy Bailey would not live to see another day, no matter what she pleaded. As the car pulled up to the isolated house in Gans, Cindy had no idea what awaited her inside. But it wouldn't matter. What was about to unfold in that house would be far worse than anything she could have imagined. The house in Gans stood like a quiet monument to horror, a place that should have offered safety and security, but instead became the setting for Cindy's last moments of terror. As soon as the car stopped, Lois and Greg dragged Cindy from the vehicle. Cindy's legs were barely able to support her, but she was still alive, still struggling to hold on to whatever fragments of hope were left in her. She had no idea that the nightmare was just beginning. Lois led her inside the house with cold, determined steps, pushing Cindy ahead of her like a piece of discarded baggage. The blood from Cindy's throat wound left a trail behind them, marking their journey like a haunting signature. Cindy's legs wobbled, but she didn't collapse. She fought to keep going, even as the world around her spun. The house, an otherwise unremarkable rural dwelling, would become the scene of unimaginable brutality. Inside, Cindy was forced into a recliner, her body still weak from the injuries inflicted on her during the car ride. She was in a state of shock, her mind likely clouded by the pain, the blood loss, and the growing sense of dread. Every movement was agony, but there was something else that tormented her, something much worse than physical pain. It was the overwhelming sense that she was utterly alone, trapped in a house with no escape, with two people who wanted her dead. Lois took control immediately. There was no hesitation. She pulled a pistol from somewhere in the house, her face cold and emotionless, the weight of her actions already settled into her mind. The gun was aimed directly at Cindy's face. "You're going to die today," Lois said, her voice chillingly calm. Lois wasn't speaking to Cindy like a person. She wasn't even speaking to someone she once knew. To Lois, Cindy was no longer a woman, no longer a daughter, no longer a victim. Cindy had become the enemy, an obstacle that needed to be eliminated. And Lois had no intention of sparing her. "I'm going to kill you for what you said about my son," Lois continued. The words hung in the air as if she had justified them in her own mind. In her world, Cindy's supposed betrayal of Greg was unforgivable, a sin deserving of the ultimate punishment. Cindy, broken and terrified, had nothing left to defend herself with. She pleaded for her life, a fragile whisper of desperation in the face of certain death. "Please, I never threatened Greg, I swear. Please don't do this," Cindy begged, her voice trembling. But Lois didn't care about Cindy's pleas. Lois had already made up her mind. This was not about truth, not about reconciliation. This was about Lois's need to protect her son at all costs, no matter the cost to Cindy, no matter the pain she inflicted on an innocent woman. The first shot hit Cindy square in the chest, throwing her backward in the recliner and sending her crumpling to the floor. Blood spilled from the new wound, mixing with the blood already soaked into her clothes. Cindy's body shook with the impact, but she was still alive. Still breathing, still conscious. Lois wasn't satisfied. For Lois, the punishment wasn't over. It had only just begun. The scene in the house turned more grotesque as Lois's cruelty became apparent. She wasn't just content with shooting Cindy once. Lois had decided that Cindy would suffer. As Cindy lay on the floor gasping for air, her body weak and trembling from blood loss, Lois handed the gun to Greg. "Reload it," Lois ordered him. Her voice cold and emotionless. Greg took the gun, the same gun that had just been used to shoot Cindy, and began reloading it. The air in the room thickened with an unspoken tension. Greg, standing in the background, did as he was told. He didn't question his mother. He didn't protest. He simply obeyed. And as Lois stood over Cindy's broken body, her laughter echoed through the room, inhuman, twisted, and terrifying. She wasn't crying or shouting. She was laughing. Lois took her position above Cindy, her feet placed over the victim's neck. Cindy, still alive, could only watch as Lois began jumping up and down on her neck, crushing her throat beneath the weight of her body. With every jump, Cindy's breath grew more labored. Her hands flailed, weakly trying to protect herself, but Lois wasn't stopping. Lois's laughter was like a cruel mockery of Cindy's suffering, a sound that would haunt Greg for the rest of his life. It wasn't until Greg had finished reloading the gun that Lois aimed it once again at Cindy. She shot her. Several more times, each shot tearing through Cindy's chest, ensuring that her victim would not survive. Cindy's body was racked with the final blows, her life slipping away with each pull of the trigger. The final shots were even more brutal. Lois placed the gun behind Cindy's head and fired twice more, ending her life. The last of Cindy's breath left her in a final painful gasp. The horror didn't end with the murder. Afterward, Lois and Greg attempted to clean up the scene, but they knew their actions couldn't be undone. They disposed of Cindy's body, making sure to cover their tracks. For a while, they succeeded. Cindy Bailey was reported as missing, and the authorities had no reason to suspect that something far more sinister had occurred. But secrets like these are never buried forever. The truth would eventually surface, and when it did, it would expose Lois's chilling capacity for cruelty and the unthinkable role her son played in it. In that house in Gans, Lois had done more than just kill Cindy Bailey. She had unleashed a horror that would haunt her family and the town of Tahlequah forever. The love that Lois had once shown to her children had been twisted into something monstrous, a love so consuming that it led to murder, to torture, to a tragedy that would ripple through every life it touched. And as the investigation unfolded, it would become clear this was no spur-of-the-moment crime. It was a calculated, deliberate act of violence driven by a woman's warped sense of maternal love and the cruel lengths she was willing to go to protect her son, no matter the cost. After the brutal killing in Gans, Lois and Greg Smith thought they had done enough to cover their tracks. They had disposed of the body, cleaned up the crime scene, and gone to great lengths to make it seem like Cindy Bailey had simply disappeared. But as with all secrets, the truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how well it's hidden. In the days that followed Cindy's murder, Lois and Greg went about their lives as though nothing had happened. Lois returned to her routine, her job, and the responsibilities of daily life. To the outside world, she was the same woman she had always been, unassuming, polite, and entirely normal. But inside, she was grappling with something different: guilt, fear, or perhaps the unsettling realization that she had crossed a line from which there was no return. Yet, despite these potential inner conflicts, Lois appeared undisturbed by the gravity of her actions. Greg, too, played his part. He returned to his life just as Lois did. The murder was not something either of them discussed openly, but it weighed on them in different ways. Lois's cold demeanor suggested that she saw nothing wrong with what she had done, nothing at all. But Greg's role in the crime was something he would never be able to escape. The image of his mother's laughter, the sound of her jumping on Cindy's neck, would haunt him forever. Still, he remained loyal to Lois, continuing to cover up the crime for her, perhaps out of fear, or perhaps out of a misguided sense of devotion. Their calmness in the face of such violence The way they moved forward as though it were business as usual was chilling. But as the days passed, cracks began to appear in the facade. Cindy's family, friends, and others in the community began to ask questions. Cindy had been missing for several days, and her family was desperate to find her. The police began investigating, questioning anyone who might have had any information about her whereabouts. It wasn't long before the truth began to slip through the cracks. Cindy's friends and family knew something was off. They knew Cindy had been involved with Greg, and they knew that things had ended badly between them. But no one could have imagined the depths to which Lois would go to protect her son. The rumors about Greg's drug involvement and the tension between Cindy and Lois seemed to add up. The authorities began to dig deeper, but Lois and Greg seemed to have covered their tracks well. There were no immediate leads, no direct evidence to suggest they were responsible for Cindy's disappearance. For a while it seemed like the case would go cold, like so many others that involve missing persons in small towns. However, things took a turn when a tip came in. Someone from the community, a person who knew Lois, or perhaps someone with knowledge of Greg's involvement, finally spoke up. It wasn't much, just a vague hint at the possibility of foul play, but it was enough to prompt investigators to take another look at the case. This was the break the police had been hoping for, and it would eventually lead them down a path that Lois and Greg thought they had escaped. A search was launched, and more questions were asked. The pieces of the puzzle that Lois and Greg had so carefully concealed began to fall apart. It wasn't just the physical evidence that would eventually tie them to the crime. It was the subtle inconsistencies in their story, the cracks in their calm demeanor, and the testimony of people who knew them. It became clear that Lois and Greg had been far from perfect in their cover-up. Their actions, no matter how carefully planned, couldn't erase the horror they had inflicted on Cindy and her family. The most damning piece of evidence came when investigators pieced together the events of the night Cindy disappeared. Lois and Greg had been seen together in the area, and forensic evidence would soon confirm that Cindy had been killed in the house in Gans. The physical evidence, the bloodstains, the gunshot residue, and the signs of a violent struggle made it clear that Lois and Greg were the only ones responsible for Cindy's death. The most chilling part of the investigation was the discovery of the phone call that Lois had made to her ex-husband's house in Gans just hours before the murder. Lois had known exactly what she was doing, and she had planned this from the moment she decided Cindy was a threat to her son. She had gone to extreme lengths to make sure that no one would be able to connect her to the crime. But in the end, the truth could not be hidden forever. As investigators closed in on Lois and Greg, their carefully constructed lies began to crumble. The evidence of their involvement in Cindy's murder was overwhelming, and it wasn't just physical evidence that implicated them. It was the testimony of witnesses who had heard strange things, seen unusual behavior, or simply knew too much for it all to be a coincidence. Lois and Greg's attempt to hide the crime was unraveling before their eyes. The case against them was airtight. As the investigation progressed, Greg began to feel the weight of what he had helped his mother do. He wasn't just an observer. He had played an active role in the murder. He had reloaded the gun. He had helped drag Cindy's body from the car. And in his silence, he had been complicit in the brutal torture of a young woman. The guilt began to eat away at him. Faced with the overwhelming evidence against them, Greg made a decision that would seal his fate and that of his mother. He cut a deal with the prosecution. In exchange for a reduced sentence, Greg agreed to testify against his mother. This was the beginning of the end for Lois. The truth that Lois had tried so hard to bury was now coming to light. Her own son, the one she had tried to protect above all else, was turning against her. Greg's testimony was damning. He described in detail how his mother had planned the murder, how she had ordered him to reload the gun, how she had laughed while torturing Cindy. His testimony painted a horrifying picture of the events that had unfolded in the house in Gans. For Lois, the trial would become a battle not just for her freedom, but for her identity. Her defense team attempted to argue that Lois had been under the influence of alcohol or drugs when the crime occurred, or that she had acted out of a warped sense of self-defense. But the evidence of premeditation, the calculated way in which Lois had planned Cindy's murder, made these arguments seem weak and unconvincing. Lois's fate was sealed. The jury had seen enough. As the trial came to a close and the verdict was read, Lois's life began its downward spiral. The damage had been done. There was no going back. And what followed would be years of appeals, legal battles, and a fight for her life as she awaited her execution. The story of Lois and Greg Smith was one of a mother's twisted love and a son's loyalty gone wrong. Their attempt to cover up Cindy's murder was ultimately futile. The truth came out, and Lois's actions would haunt her family, the community, and everyone involved for the rest of their lives. As the case moved toward its grim conclusion, the question remained, could Lois ever truly be forgiven for what she had done? And could anyone, least of all her own son, ever come to terms with the horrific crime that had torn their family apart? After Lois and Greg were arrested for the brutal murder of Cindy Bailey, the case took center stage in Oklahoma. What followed would be a legal battle that would span years, filled with twists and turns, testimony from both sides, and the ultimate question of whether Lois Smith would live or die for her crime. This part delves into the courtroom drama, focusing on the prosecution's arguments, the defense's counterclaims, and the damning evidence that would seal Lois's fate. The trial of Lois Smith was set to be one of the most highly publicized cases in Oklahoma's history. The shock of the murder, especially the brutal torture Cindy endured, had shaken the local community to its core. It wasn't just the violence of the crime that was so shocking, but the involvement of Lois's own son, Greg. The idea of a mother and son working together to commit such a horrific act sent ripples of disbelief through the town and beyond. The question now was whether justice would be served, and if so, what that justice would look like. The prosecution wasted no time in making its case. From the beginning, they painted Lois as a cold-blooded killer who had meticulously planned the murder of Cindy Bailey. The evidence was overwhelming. Forensic experts testified to the brutal nature of Cindy's death, describing the multiple gunshot wounds and the viciousness of the torture. The autopsy confirmed that Cindy had not just been shot. She had been deliberately mutilated. Her throat had been stabbed, and the final blows had been to her head, a point-blank execution. But the most damning evidence came from Greg. As part of a plea deal with the prosecution, Greg agreed to testify against his mother in exchange for a life sentence instead of the death penalty. Greg's testimony was nothing short of devastating. He described in graphic detail how his mother had orchestrated the murder, how she had planned it from the very beginning, and how he had been complicit in it. Greg spoke about how Lois had dragged Cindy from the car, how she had forced her into the recliner in the house in Gans, and how Lois had laughed as she tortured Cindy. The most chilling part of Greg's testimony was his description of the moment when Lois handed him the gun to reload, her laughter echoing through the room as she jumped on Cindy's neck. The jury listened in stunned silence as Greg recounted the brutality of the crime, his words painting a picture of a mother who had crossed the line into madness, a son who had been too loyal or too frightened to stop her. The prosecution argued that this was not a spur-of-the-moment crime, but a premeditated act of murder. They painted Lois as someone who had been plotting Cindy's death for weeks, someone who believed that Cindy was a threat to her son and was willing to go to any length to eliminate that threat. The prosecution suggested that Lois had acted out of a twisted sense of protection for Greg, but ultimately it was about control and revenge. The prosecutors were clear in their argument. This wasn't just murder. It was torture. It was cruel. And it was deliberate. The fact that Lois had planned the murder and carried it out with such coldness made her actions deserving of the death penalty. The defense, however, attempted to cast Lois in a different light. They argued that Lois had been suffering from the emotional scars of years of abuse and hardship, and that she had been acting out of a deeply distorted sense of love and protection for her son. Her history of being beaten and emotionally destroyed by her first husband was central to their defense. They argued that Lois's violent tendencies had been shaped by years of suffering, and that when she killed Cindy, she was acting out of a deep, misguided desire to protect Greg from a perceived threat. Lois's defense team also pointed to her relationship with Greg, suggesting that her protective instincts had become twisted to the point of obsession. The defense argued that Lois's actions were fueled by a belief that she was the only person who could save her son from a dangerous world, and that this distorted thinking clouded her judgment and led to the murder. But there was a problem with this defense. It didn't excuse the brutality of the crime. Lois's history of abuse might explain some of her actions, but it didn't justify the violence and torture she inflicted on Cindy. The prosecution's case was strong, and the defense's arguments were ultimately not enough to sway the jury. One of the key aspects of Lois's defense was her mental state. Her attorneys suggested that Lois had been acting under the influence of alcohol or drugs at the time of the murder, and they also argued that her emotional state had been severely impacted by years of abuse. They claimed that Lois's judgment had been clouded by the trauma she had experienced throughout her life. But the prosecution countered by pointing to the evidence of premeditation. Lois had planned the murder, had gathered weapons, and had carefully orchestrated every detail. The fact that she had taken the time to reload the gun after the first round of shots was evidence enough that she was not acting out of a momentary lapse in judgment, but with clear intent. The defense also argued that Lois was a first-time offender and that her background should be taken into account when determining her punishment. They suggested that she was not the same person who had committed the crime all those years ago, and that her actions should be understood in the context of her life. But again, the prosecution maintained that the crime was too brutal, too calculated, and too heinous to be excused by her past. As the trial went on, Lois's mental state became a central issue. Her defense team argued that she was suffering from severe emotional distress, but the prosecution countered that her actions were the result of a deliberate decision to kill Cindy. They painted Lois as a woman who had become consumed by a toxic love for her son, a woman who had justified murder in the name of protection. The case was a study in the complexities of maternal love and the destructive power of obsession. In the end, the jury deliberated and returned a verdict that was a foregone conclusion for most observers. Lois Smith was found guilty of first-degree murder. The question now was whether she would be sentenced to death or to life in prison. The sentencing phase of the trial was another emotional roller coaster. Lois's defense team argued for leniency, pointing to her abusive past and the trauma she had experienced. They suggested that she had suffered enough in her life and that she should be spared the death penalty. They painted her as a victim of circumstances, someone who had been pushed to the edge by years of suffering. But the prosecution maintained that the crime was so heinous, so cruel, that it deserved the ultimate punishment. They argued that Lois had taken a life in the most brutal way possible and that her actions were unforgivable. The victim, Cindy Bailey, had been tortured and murdered in cold blood. There was no excuse for what Lois had done. After much deliberation, the jury recommended the death penalty. Lois Smith would pay the ultimate price for her actions. As the court proceedings concluded, the case didn't end with a verdict. It sparked an ongoing debate about the death penalty, about whether someone like Lois, a woman shaped by a life of abuse, could ever be fully responsible for her actions. Could she be rehabilitated? Or did her crime deserve the ultimate punishment? The legal battle was far from over, and Lois would continue to fight for her life, using every possible appeal to avoid execution. But the verdict had been delivered, and the legal system had spoken. Lois Smith was sentenced to death for her role in the murder of Cindy Bailey. The question now was whether justice had been served, or if the system had failed to recognize the trauma and pain that had shaped the woman who stood before the court. Context. After years of legal battles, appeals, and public debate, the day of Lois Smith's execution finally arrived. On December 4, 2001, Lois would become the 17th person executed in Oklahoma that year, the highest number of executions in any state. But her execution wasn't just another statistic. It was the conclusion of a long and painful journey for the families involved, especially Cindy Bailey's family, who had waited for justice for nearly 2 decades. This part of the story focuses on the final hours leading up to Lois's execution, her last meal, her final words, and the complex emotions of those who witnessed her death. The atmosphere surrounding Lois Smith's execution was one of tense anticipation. For years, Lois had fought for her life, filing appeal after appeal in an attempt to avoid the death penalty. She had exhausted all legal avenues, and now there was nowhere left to turn. The courts had ruled. The Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board had rejected her clemency request. Governor Frank Keating had refused to intervene. Lois Smith was scheduled to be executed by lethal injection at 9:00 p.m. on December 4, 2001. Lois had been housed in the Mabel Bassett Correctional Center, a women's prison in Oklahoma City, where she had spent the last years of her life in prison. As the hours ticked down to her execution, protesters gathered outside, some hoping to save her life, others there to rally for the end of the death penalty altogether. Among them was a group of 8 women who, in a desperate attempt to make their voices heard, crossed police lines and were arrested for trespassing. Their actions were a statement against the execution of Lois Smith and the broader issue of capital punishment. Inside the prison, the final preparations were underway. Lois had spent the day like any other, but as the time approached, it became clear that her life was about to come to a tragic end. For some, there was a sense of closure. For others, there was only a deep sadness, especially Cindy Bailey's family, who had waited 19 long years for justice to be done. They had seen Lois Smith's trial unfold, the media coverage and the painful years of appeals, but it was only now, as the date of execution neared, that they felt the weight of what they had been through. At 5 p.m., Lois made her final request. She asked for a simple meal, a last comfort, before she was put to death. Her final meal consisted of barbecued ribs, onion rings, a slice of strawberry banana cake, and cherry lemonade. It was a meal that would take her back to a time before everything had fallen apart, before she became a prisoner, before the brutal murder of Cindy Bailey had forever changed her life. It was a simple, nostalgic meal, a reminder of a time when she had a life that didn't involve prison bars or the looming threat of death. As the clock moved closer to the appointed hour, Lois was allowed to make a phone call to her attorneys, who would continue their last-ditch efforts to stop the execution. But those efforts proved futile. The legal system had made its decision, and there would be no last-minute reprieve. At 8:00 p.m., Lois was escorted from her cell to the execution chamber, where the lethal injection would be administered. Her steps were slow, deliberate, perhaps a reflection of the weight of what was about to happen. Her face was calm, but there was no escaping the reality of the moment. Lois had spent years fighting for her life, appealing her conviction, claiming that she was a victim of circumstance shaped by a traumatic past. But now there was no more fighting, no more appeals. This was the moment she had been facing for nearly 2 decades. In the witness room, Cindy Bailey's family had gathered. The victim's daughter, Brandy Fields, now 24 years old, had waited almost her entire life to see justice done. Brandy was just 5 years old when her mother was brutally murdered. Now, as a young woman, she was about to witness the execution of the woman who had taken her mother's life. With her in the witness room were other family members, Brandy's husband, her sister, and a family friend. For them, this was the moment of closure, but it was also the end of a 19-year nightmare. On the other side of the witness room were Lois's attorneys and her spiritual advisor. Lois had no family members there, a stark contrast to the witnesses for Cindy Bailey. As Lois was strapped to the gurney, the reality of the moment set in. This was the final chapter of a long and painful story. The victim's family was about to witness the end of the woman who had destroyed their lives. For Lois, this was the final reckoning. At 9:13 p.m., the execution began. The lethal injection was administered through the IV lines inserted into Lois's arms. The drugs were carefully delivered into her bloodstream, starting with a sedative to render her unconscious, followed by drugs to induce paralysis and stop her heart. As the chemicals flowed through her body, the witness room watched in silence, a mix of emotion and solemnity hanging in the air. Lois's final moments were quick, but they were far from painless. Witnesses reported that her face tightened and her body twitched slightly, as if she were experiencing the pain of the lethal drugs coursing through her veins. In the end, though, it was a quiet death. At 9:13 p.m., Lois Nadean Smith was pronounced dead. Brandy Fields, who had waited almost 2 decades for this moment, was overcome with emotion as she spoke to the press afterward. "I'm glad it's over," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "It's been a long time." Brandy's words were the culmination of a long journey. She had been just 5 years old when her mother was murdered. Now, 19 years later, she had seen justice done, but it wasn't the kind of justice anyone could truly take comfort in. Lois Smith's death marked the end of a tragic chapter, but it didn't bring back Cindy Bailey. It didn't undo the pain that Lois's actions had caused, nor could it erase the devastation in the lives of those who had loved Cindy. Lois was the 17th person executed in Oklahoma that year, and the 47th since the state had reinstated the death penalty in 1990. She was the 63rd person executed. In the United States that year, Lois's execution also serves as a painful reminder of the complexities surrounding the death penalty. Was justice served in her case? Did the death penalty offer closure to Cindy's family? Or was it just another chapter in a long, painful story of revenge, punishment, and loss? These are the questions that lingered in the wake of Lois Smith's death. As the witnesses left the execution chamber, the weight of the day's events hung in the air. Lois Smith's life was over, but the repercussions of her actions, both the murder and the execution, would resonate for years to come. What had begun as a brutal act of violence had ended in an execution. But for Cindy's family, it was more than just an eye for an eye. It was the painful and complicated pursuit of justice, one that could never truly bring back what had been lost. The execution of Lois Nadean Smith was the culmination of years of legal battles, public protests, and deep moral and ethical debates surrounding the death penalty. While her execution may have provided a sense of closure for Cindy Bailey's family, it also raised broader questions about justice, punishment, and the very nature of the death penalty. This final part examines the lasting legacy of Lois Smith's case, how it impacts the conversation about the death penalty, and the moral complexities of the case. The death of Lois Smith did not mark the end of the conversation surrounding her crime. While Cindy Bailey's family may have found some sense of closure with Lois's execution, the case left behind a tangled legacy, one that raises difficult questions about justice, punishment, and the limitations of the legal system. Lois's execution was the result of a brutal, calculated crime that had affected multiple families, but it also highlighted the complex nature of the death penalty itself. For the Bailey family, the execution was a long-awaited moment of justice. They had suffered for nearly 2 decades, waiting for the day when the woman who had tortured and killed Cindy would finally face the consequences of her actions. Brandy Fields, Cindy's daughter, spoke for many when she expressed that her mother's killer had finally paid the price for her crime. For Brandy, there was a sense of closure, but it wasn't the kind of closure that brings peace or comfort. It was a reminder of the years of pain, confusion, and trauma that her family had endured since that fateful day in 1982. But for others, Lois's execution sparked a much more complex debate, one that resonated far beyond the specifics of this particular case. The execution of Lois Smith reignited the national conversation about the death penalty. Should the state have the authority to take a life in the name of justice? Is capital punishment truly an effective deterrent for crime, or is it a broken system that disproportionately impacts marginalized communities? The questions are not easily answered, and the execution of Lois Smith only added fuel to the fire. Proponents of the death penalty argue that it is a necessary tool for punishing the most heinous crimes. In cases like Lois's, they believe that the severity of the crime, Cindy's brutal murder, and the torture she endured justifies the ultimate punishment. They argue that the death penalty serves as a deterrent, a way to show society that certain actions will not be tolerated, that there are consequences to cruelty. For them, the execution of Lois Smith represented a sense of justice served for the brutal act she had committed. But critics of the death penalty question whether it truly serves justice. For many, the execution of Lois Smith was a reminder of the flaws in the criminal justice system and the potential for errors, injustices, and inequities. Lois had claimed throughout her trial and subsequent appeals that her violent actions were the result of years of trauma and abuse. She had been a victim of an abusive marriage, and her distorted sense of justice came from years of hardship, emotional scars, and a misguided love for her son. The defense team's argument about Lois's background was a plea for mitigation, suggesting that her actions were, at least in part, the result of her past, which had been filled with violence and pain. Many argue that the death penalty is a punitive system that fails to address the underlying causes of crime, such as poverty, abuse, mental illness, and systemic inequalities. They argue that the state's decision to execute someone like Lois Smith, who had a troubled past shaped by abuse, raises significant questions about whether capital punishment is an appropriate or effective solution. Lois's case may have been an extreme example, but it also brought to light the broader issues surrounding how we deal with crime, punishment, and the people caught in the system. Lois's case also brings into focus the role of family loyalty in criminal behavior. Greg Smith, her son, had been her accomplice, helping her carry out the murder of Cindy Bailey. He was motivated by a distorted sense of love and loyalty to his mother. Lois's deep-seated need to protect her son at any cost had warped her sense of reality, and it had led her to involve Greg in her violent plans. The bond between mother and son, while understandable in many ways, had led to a catastrophic breakdown of moral boundaries. Lois's actions, her willingness to involve Greg, and the brutality with which she carried out the murder raise uncomfortable questions about the influence of family loyalty on criminal behavior and whether such loyalties should be taken into account when determining guilt or punishment. Another important aspect of Lois's case is the question of mental health and how it intersects with the justice system. Lois's defense team pointed to her history of abuse and emotional trauma, suggesting that she was not fully in control of her actions at the time of Cindy's murder. But the prosecution rejected this claim, focusing instead on the fact that Lois had premeditated the crime and had made deliberate choices in carrying it out. Her clear intent to kill Cindy, they argued, made her actions unforgivable. The question of whether mental illness or trauma can and should mitigate the severity of punishment is one that continues to divide opinion. Moreover, Lois's execution raises the uncomfortable question of whether the state should be in the business of taking lives. Is there ever a justifiable reason for the state to execute a person? Can the legal system truly balance the scales of justice by ending someone's life in the name of justice? For many, the death penalty is a symbolic act, a statement about the value of human life and the need to protect society from those who commit the most horrific crimes. But for others, it represents an irrevocable act of state-sanctioned violence, one that is irreversible, potentially flawed, and unable to heal the wounds caused by crime. In the years following Lois's execution, her case continued to be a topic of debate in Oklahoma and beyond. While some saw it as a clear-cut case of justice, others believed that it was a symptom of a broken and outdated system that needed reform. The conversation surrounding the death penalty, sparked in part by Lois's execution, continues to evolve. As new generations challenge old ideas and demand a more thoughtful, compassionate approach to crime and punishment. The legacy of Lois Nadean Smith is complex. She was not a simple case of a villainous woman who needed to be punished. Lois's past, her trauma, and her warped sense of protection for her son all contributed to the actions that led to Cindy's death. But that does not excuse what she did. Lois's story is a reminder that the path to violence is often a long one, shaped by years of suffering and loss, and that there are no easy answers when it comes to matters of justice, punishment, and forgiveness. Lois Smith's execution marked the end of a long and painful chapter, but it also served as a catalyst for broader conversations about the role of the death penalty in modern society. Was justice truly served when Lois Smith was executed, or was she a victim of circumstances beyond her control? The answers are complex, and that is why cases like Lois's continue to challenge our assumptions about crime, punishment, and the justice system itself. As we reflect on Lois's case, we are reminded of the difficult moral questions that surround the death penalty. And while we may never have definitive answers, understanding the complexities of cases like this can help us come to terms with the profound nature of crime, punishment, and the human experience.